Okay. So thank you so much, Ashish, for joining. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the recipe of ecosystem building and partnership facilitation mechanism. When we speak of partnerships, we often talk about alignments, coordination, funding, implementation, scale, and impact. But we would go a layer deeper today. We want to ask who defines development, who owns the process, whose knowledge counts. And I have studied in Sussex, and we also call it like whose reality counts. Um, who benefits from these partnership, and can an ecosystem be built not just for delivery, but for justice, ecological balance, and maybe shared ownership? So to explore this, we have with us Ashish Kothari, whose work over several decades has challenged mainstream development thinking and helped bring attention to community-led alternatives, ecological democracy, and people-centered transformation. So this would be, as Ashish says, a chopal conversation, and we'll keep it simple, reflective, and conversational and practical, and others can also join this. We'll move from his journey to his critique of development, and then to alternative models, and finally to what ecosystem builders and partnership facilitators can learn from his work. So, Ashish, thank you for being with us. I want to begin not with theory, but your own journey. Um, what were the early experiences that made you question the dominant idea of development?
Thanks, Ankush. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to this forum. Thanks to you and everybody else who has made this possible. Um, my journey in broadly environmental, ecological, and development issues started when I was in high school. I was growing up in New Delhi, and I was, like many of my other colleagues, also interested in nature, animal rights, going out into forest areas, doing bird watching, and so on. And Delhi is actually lucky; it's blessed to have one of the largest city forests in the world, the Delhi Ridge, which is the last part of the Aravallis.
Right.
And one of the things we were seeing was its destruction for urbanization, road construction, garbage dumping, etc. And we felt that while we were enjoying being in that forest, we also should be responsible to do something about this destruction. Around the same time, there were also issues of hunting, including hunting by Saudi Arabian princes of threatened species of birds, and a few other such things. So we began in 1978, 79 with some campaigns when we were in high school. One of them was the protection of the Delhi Ridge Forest and against the hunting of bustards and so on in Rajasthan, and a few other such campaigns. And we were doing that kind of sporadically as students, as young people. That we realized that if we want to do this more systematically, if we want to bring up these sorts of issues which were about our future, which was being ruined by adults who were taking decisions, then we needed to do it more, a bit more systematically, and which is why the organization Kalpavriksha was formed back in 1979. And then around the same time, we also had been hearing about other movements like the Chipko movement in the Himalaya, to primarily a women's movement to protect forests, anti-mining movements in Goa, and the movement of traditional fisher communities against commercial fisheries and trawling in the coasts, and so on. So we thought that we should spend our holidays, our vacations, going to these places and learning about why those movements are there, what are they saying. And this is where the idea of questioning development came in. If development meant logging forests in the Himalaya at the expense of local communities and wildlife there, if it meant commercial trawling of fisheries in the coasts of Goa or mining in Goa at the cost of the communities there and the wildlife, then was that really development or was it destruction? And if it was destruction, then what could development, which actually benefits everybody, and protects the environment, what would it mean? So that's the sort of questioning there. And in 1983, we did a long walk along the Narmada River, a 50-day walk along the river from the mouth to the head. And that is because we were wanting to know what would be the impacts of the proposed big dams, the Narmada Valley Development Project at that time. So during this 50-day thing, this question of what is really development, because those dams, of course, would have produced electricity and irrigation, but at the same time, they would have displaced tens of thousands of people and drowned out very, very rich, biologically diverse forests. So it was the question kind of got very sharp in our minds around that time.
No, yeah, I mean, I wanted to follow up with understanding. You mentioned Narmada Bachao Andolan, and you uh, was there any particular, I mean, movement, community, or probably a moment that changed? Specifically, do you remember any? When we all remember that this is the point when I thought this is how I'm going to live, or rather, like this is what I am going to pursue.
I am not sure about any one moment. I mean, I can recall some 3 or 4 in those early years. I think one of them was I used to be, I still am into sort of animal rights in a certain way. And I remember reading in 1978, I think it was about monkeys, rhesus macaques being exported from India to the US for these really horrifying experiments,
Hmm.
which were meant to look at human safety. So I was saying, why would other animals be sacrificed for human safety? And so just reading about that, kind of something in my heart and mind said, this is wrong. This is ethically wrong. So that is when sort of animal rights kind of issues came into me. That was one. The second, I think, would be in the Chipko, the trek. We did 2 treks through the Chipko movement area in Tehri Garhwal, 1980 and 81. And I remember the first village we went to, and we met the women who were part of the Andolan. That was, for me, quite a eye opener, because the women were explaining how they relate to the forests, not just in terms of material needs like fodder and fuel wood and fruits and so on, but spiritually and culturally as their brothers. And to me, that was like, again, it wasn't just about protecting forests for our sake, but for their own sake, for looking at wildlife and forests and environment as something in its own right, not just for human consumption. And the holistic relationship that communities have with their natural environment, right? So, I mean, these are some, but there are many others. In Narmada, let me give you another one. Narmada, when we were walking along those areas, and then we met up with a lot of communities. We also met with what are called parikrama-vasis. These are people who actually circumambulate the whole river on foot, 2,600 kilometers. And they then basically, so they do it barefoot. They don't take anything with them. They carry almost nothing. They get fed along the way by villagers. It's still happening, but now very difficult with all the dams. And when we spoke to some of them, they were saying these dams, why are dams being built? This river is meant to flow free. She, Ma Narmada, ko aviral behne do, as in let her continue to flow free. And for me, that was like, again, something that here are people talking about the right of a river to flow free, not just human beings to use the river. So these are all moments, I think, in those early years when the connect with how communities look at the rest of nature, and then the connect with nature itself was, these were all, in some senses, wake up moments for me.
Well, thanks for sharing, and I think those moments become equally important along with the frameworks and journey we have. Before I move to the next segment, I have another question in this space only. Um, so I think most of your journey started with resisting this existing model of development. When did you start thinking about like alternative models of development, or is there a different way possible?
Well, in a sense, it began in those early years. We didn't think of it as alternatives at that time. But for instance, if we were in touch with a lot of farmers who were trying to switch back to or go to new forms of organic farming against the green revolution, pesticide, hybrid kind of a model that the government had been pushing. And in a sense, that was already an alternative, right? So saying against the dominant system of agriculture and food production, here were either traditional or new ways in which farmers were saying, this is actually, we're working with the earth, with the land, with the seeds to produce things in an ecologically responsible way. And it's also healthier for us because we're not consuming all that, all those chemicals. Similarly, then when we started working on conservation, wildlife conservation, at that time, the dominant model was, still unfortunately is from the government, is that the government will set up protected areas like tiger reserves and people will be kicked out and a bureaucracy or a forest department will actually protect the wildlife. Now, we were actually looking on the ground and saying, but communities also protect forest and ecosystem. Chipko as an example that I just gave you, right? So why can't wildlife conservation, biodiversity conservation happen with and by communities rather than by governments imposing themselves? And using the knowledge, I mean, people have grown up in these ecosystems for generations, in some cases millennia. So what about their own knowledge actually being very centrally part of the conservation model? So we started talking about community-led conservation also back then. So these were all alternatives. But then what I and some others felt around 2010-11 was that we needed to work more systematically on this, not just in specific fields like agriculture and forests and so on, but like if we are critiquing development, if we're saying no to, say, big dams and mining, etc., what is it we're saying yes to? How do people meet their needs? How do people meet their aspirations without destroying the earth or without creating the huge amounts of inequalities that we have in society, right? Or the deprivation that this causes. So that was our quest. And so around that time, we decided we should, within Kalpavriksha and with other organizations, begin a more clear and systematic journey towards looking at what alternatives there are. What are the alternatives that people are already practicing? What more needs to be done? And then how should society, including economy and politics and all of that, change in order to make this kind of alternative ways of living much more possible? So this is, I would say, maybe about 15, 16 years back. And then we began that process within the organization in Kalpavriksha, but then we also created in 2014 this network called Vikalp Sangam, which I can talk about later.
So, you talked about critiquing the dominant development model. What would be like some of the points exactly you are critiquing? Is it like the centralized power, e- ecological extraction, inequality, economic growth, like, or do you have also like an order in which you look at these topics?
Now, there's no order necessarily. I mean, of course, my and my colleagues' inquiry into this started with the ecological perspective, like why should we be exploiting and destroying nature for so-called development? That's how it started. But then, of course, perspectives of inequality, social injustice, displacement of communities. I don't know if you know this, but more than 60 million people, 6 crore people have been displaced by development projects, physically uprooted from their lands and asked to leave or thrown out, or in very few cases actually rehabilitated. So the costs were something that for us were, I mean, more and more of these costs were actually getting built into our uh, our understanding. Now, the problem with development as it is currently defined and promoted, there are many. One of them is that it is defined very narrowly as GDP growth. So the percentage growth in, say, products and services and so on and so forth, right? Um, and that is a very, very narrow tunnel vision way of looking at development. Now, if you think of the word development itself, it means um, unraveling, opening up opportunities. It's the opposite of envelopment. You know, in the old times, we used to send letters to each other in envelopes. Most people don't do that anymore. Envelopment is to enclose, the development is to open up. And so it should be opening up all kinds of opportunities for people and nature to flourish, right? But it's been defined only as percentage GDP, which means percentage economic growth by almost all countries in the world. And this means that virtually every country is saying we want 5, 6, 10% growth at any cost. And we've had our finance ministers actually saying this. We have to have economic growth at any cost. So that's number one. And the reason why that's a problem is because we have a finite planet. We have a certain amount of natural resources and nature that we can actually depend on. It is replenished by, say, rainfall, etc. But that also there's a limit. So it's like a bank. You go to a bank, you got 100 rupees capital there, you can use 10 rupees interest, but if you use more than that, you're eating into that capital. Eventually, your bank will have to be shut down. Your bank account will have to be shut down. That's exactly what we've been doing to the earth. And we're already at 1.5 overshoot, which means we are using more than 1.5 times what we can actually afford to use sustainably. So economic growth, perpetual economic growth is very serious anomaly. It's a flaw in design. Secondly, this model of development, which we have copied almost wholesale from the West, is large scale industrialization, large scale infrastructure. The faster, the better, the bigger, the better, etc. Right. So that's why we see um, massive investments, let's say, in green revolution technologies, whereas in fact, much smaller investments in enabling small farmers to do sustainable agroecological organic farming would go much further than actually pumping in huge amount. 200,000 crores of rupees subsidy in chemical fertilizers. One of the biggest subsidies of the government of India, right? Whereas in fact, one could be doing things with much less resources if we used the alternative approaches. So, so this whole thing on infrastructure and so on. Let's take another example. I mean, I've been doing an analysis of the annual budget, and in the last few years, if you look at the uh, our government keeps saying we are trying to achieve sustainability. We are for sustainable development. Now, what is sustainability? Sustainability would mean that the ecological aspects of sustainability are very centrally in planning, right? Well, let's just take one figure. The National Highways Authority has 60 times more budget than the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. Just one authority of building highways. Now, when they
Right.
make these expressways and highways, projects like Char Dham, etc., and if the Environment Ministry, assuming it's serious, even raises an issue, it's very easily brushed aside, right? And mostly they don't even raise the issues anymore. So, so that's the second sort of big issue with this. What is
And definitely, like, even what resources are being generated through Campa and all are not being used.
No, they're not being used, and they won't be used. I mean, they get used for things like buying jeeps for the forest department, but they're not used for fundamental things. Third, that nature is treated as a externality. So this is part of the neoliberal economics. The neoliberal economics, when you do a development project, you'll calculate labor, you'll calculate capital cost, you'll calculate technology, etc. But you will not calculate the cost of destroying or using or exploiting nature. Now, there's a very interesting study that was done about 12, 13 years back by the World Bank. Unfortunately, the World Bank is the one that pushes this model a lot, but sometimes it comes up with interesting studies. So one of them was showing how ecological destruction in just 3 or 4 kinds of destruction, like air pollution, soil erosion, etc., was costing India the equivalent of 5.7 percentage points GDP annually. Now, that was at a time when our growth was, I think, 6 or 7%, which means, in effect, it was all nullified.
Yeah.
If you were to put the value of nature into this, and you can't even value most of nature, but even that
Right.
limited amount that you can value. Fourth, this model of development assumes that, to quote a Narmada Dam engineer long back who I spoke to, if you want to make an omelette, some eggs have to be broken. Now, who are those eggs? Those eggs are the 60 million people displaced by big dams and mining and so on and so forth, right? Those eggs are nature or wildlife, for instance, right? Now, I asked him, I said, okay, but why are the eggs always the Dalits and the Adivasis and the women in these communities and the wild animals? Why not rich people? Why is it that people sitting in, I don't know, Nariman Point or somewhere in Mumbai pay the cost of this? Why are they not displaced? Or suppose, for instance, you found gold under that area or under the Rashtrapati Bhavan, would you say, okay, President Saab, sorry, sir, but you have, or madam, you have to actually move out because there's gold under? You don't do that. But if it's an Adivasi community, you say, oh, they have to be displaced for this national interest. So this whole thing of omelette by whom, for whom, and against whom, who are the eggs that are broken, is a big, big question also in this model of development. So these are 3 or 4 of many things why we feel there's a fundamental flaw in the design.
Right. So I would also like you to quickly touch upon one philosophy of endowment to empowerment. And second, a redistribution model correction in the neoliberal economy. How do you see those two things together or separately?
Sorry, what was the first one? Just repeat that.
The endowment to empowerment, basically the concept of livelihood from the ecosystem someone is operating from.
Uh-huh.
I think that's something which you probably promote, right? So what I have, I want to be empowered from that. You don't
Right.
take that away to empower me in some other way.
Yeah. So both in development, and actually I don't even use the word development anymore. I use the word well-being because we all need to be well. Both in well-being and in conservation, this is a very, very important approach, what you're mentioning. So whether it is Adivasis in a forest which has tigers, and we want to protect tigers, which is of course a good objective, their own knowledge systems, their own institutional structures, they have their own governance systems, they have their own way of relating to the forest in ways that, they restrain themselves in many different ways. Build on that. If there is something from modern conservation's knowledge and science that can be added to it, add that, sure. But don't say you move these people out and we will put in only modern, which actually even modern conservation science is not used. Very often it's just bureaucratic approaches that are done. But you can say the same thing about water, you can say about food, you can say about housing, you can say about energy, any of the basic needs and aspirations, or even livelihoods. Let's take livelihoods. We in the past had perhaps something like 150 to 200 million people employed in crafts or getting their livelihoods through crafts. Okay. So that's the second highest, it has been the second highest livelihood generator for almost forever. Agriculture being the first, and then this. Now, when we brought in development, our approach should have been, and initially there was a little bit of that, but our approach should have been, how do we build on the capacities, the skills, the incredible expertise of these, we're all aware of the amazing crafts that India has, right? Let's build on that, enhance these livelihoods, sustain these livelihoods, create new livelihoods for those who don't have it based on these, which would have meant for the last 75 years, all of India's footwear, for instance, or most of our household items could have been produced through these household crafts. But no, we said we have to bring in all the big shoe companies and chappal companies and whatever else, virtually any sector you can think about, or textiles. We had, we were world leaders in textiles when the British came and invaded us. That wasn't large scale industries. This was actually small scale production all across the country. That is what could have been promoted, still can be as an alternative. So I'm saying that exactly this endowment thing, that people have capacity. It's a very, very weird fact of our existence today. Skill building. Government is into major sort of skill mission, skill building and all of that. We have de-skilled people who had the skills. We've displaced their craft skills or agricultural skills or whatever. And we say, oh, now they're not useful anymore. So let's skill them. And what do you want to skill them for? To fit into large scale industrialization or office clerks or whatever it is that, all the sort of manual stuff that have to be done. So this is, it's just a very, weird, ulta, upside down way of actually doing things. The second point I think you said was about, sorry, just remind me.
Redistribution model.
Redistribution. So, okay, now redistribution within a certain framework, redistribution can and should work, but it doesn't. So economists have shown that a 1% property tax and a 2% wealth transfer tax or inheritance tax or something like that, some such percentage on the richest 5% of India, that's a handful of people, would generate enough money for the government to fully fund all the welfare programs. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which they have now renamed whatever and almost completely destroyed. The food for those who don't have enough food, everything, right? But our governments are not willing to do that because they don't want to touch the ultra rich. And the ultra rich have just got richer and richer and richer. Our inequality index has actually grown in the last 20, 30 years, and especially, unfortunately, in the last 10 years, the billionaires are getting more and more rich and the poor are remaining where they are or even sinking further down in actual terms. So the redistribution would then mean, for instance, that there has to be a cap on salaries. And whatever money is being generated, redistribute it to those who actually need it. Tax the ultra rich so that it can be redistributed. But it could also mean things like electricity. Now we have a government which says we have this much power demand, and it's growing, of course. And so we have to keep producing power both by coal and so on, but also renewable energy and nuclear energy, right? Nobody is asking this question. Can we actually enable the empowerment? I'm using the word empowerment as a pun of those who don't have enough power, as in electricity, by taking away from those who are using it for extremely wasteful luxury purposes. Why should people have air conditioners in every home, every room in their house when there are 50% of the people in, say, Delhi or Mumbai who have not even a fan in their houses? So redistribution can mean many things. Land is another huge one. Huge amounts of, when we did land reforms long back in some states successfully, and you can see that their development indices are better. But in most parts of India, it didn't really work that well. And then land distribution is completely forgotten. In fact, if anything, it's now being redistributed for those with a lot of land to have even more land. A lot of land ceilings have been taken away, etc. So, true real redistribution of land to Dalits, to landless, to small farmers, etc., would actually go also a long way in meeting our needs of poverty eradication, etc. So, yeah, I mean, both of these things are very, very crucial.
It before we move to the next part, one last thing I had in mind, like most of us here in this space, or people who would be hearing this later, work in the development sector, right? It has obviously have in over the years become a profession, and I think from you, what I would want to understand is like what is that uncomfortable truth anybody who is working in the social sector should be aware of, uh, that what they are doing probably is not actually causing the real development or probably creating more problems.
Well, I think most of us who are in this sector have not really made the effort of understanding the sector, understanding the history of development, the definitions of development, where it came from. We just kind of assume ki haan, development chahiye. We need development, so therefore let's work on. Or people are poor, let's help them to move out of poverty. Those are the sort of, I mean, frankly speaking, superficial ways of trying to understand our own sector. If we were to understand it better, we would go into the sorts of factors I'm talking about. We would go into even maybe a little bit of history. Every time somebody joins the development sector, they should be made aware of the history of development. The history of development comes from World War II, which is when President Truman of the US said, "Oh, we need to export development to the whole world. They need to, be aided. They need to be helped to, basically move towards the kind of model that we have." Now, he wasn't doing that out of concern for the rest of the world. He was doing that because the American and the European economies had to be rebuilt after World War II. So, what better way than to export your own model and then create a dependence on your industries or your technologies or your knowledge and your money to the rest of the world, right? So we don't understand that. Most of us don't actually go into this history or are not taught this history when we enter it. Economic students are not taught this history, strangely enough, which they should be. Commerce students are not taught this in the way they should be. GDP, the questioning of GDP, which actually now even mainstream economists are beginning to do. How many economics departments in our universities actually do that? They still teach GDP as if it's a god, right? Economic growth as if it's a god. There's a movement across the world now, unfortunately, not so much in India, but certainly across Europe and North America and some aspects, some parts of Latin America and so on, of students of economics saying, we don't want to learn this old neoliberal economics only. We want to learn the truth about what our economies are doing to the earth and to people. We want the ecological economics to come. We want well-being economics to come so that we learn the whole range of things and then we can decide for ourselves where we want to head or what we want to do. So this is a very strong movement actually of students in many parts of the world. Anyway, so to me, I think development professionals or any of us who are in any of these fields to understand this history, to question things very fundamentally, to actually understand the impacts of what we are doing on the ground. Now, supposing we're all going with good intentions. Okay, we're going with a good intention into a village and we're saying we're going to help you to move out of poverty. And we introduce, let's say, green revolution technologies, or we introduce certain forms of, say, water, uh, you know, uh, technology heavy water uh, processes, etc. Do we really try and understand what are the social structures that will have to be built to make this work, or what social structures already exist which could actually be undermined because of this? What local knowledge of water already exists which actually gets displaced when you bring in all this outside so-called expertise? What local knowledge of producing food already exists which gets destroyed when green revolution kind of stuff is brought in? Again, it's about trying to think and visualize and understand more holistically the impacts of anything that we introduce in the name of development. And I can talk later if you want about approach we call the flower of transformation, where we look at economic, ecological, social, cultural, political aspects together as intersecting to figure out, is something really going to be beneficial, or is it going to have inadvertent negative impacts which we don't even actually realize till much later? So I would say these are something we need to be really much more careful of, much more aware of when we act as development professionals or any other such field.
Now let's move to um, the alternative, eco-Swaraj, radical ecological democracy model, right? For someone hearing for the first time, how would you explain eco-Swaraj or radical ecological democracy in simple terms?
Very simply put, it is saying that we are all decision makers wherever we are, in our villages, in our towns, in our institutions, NGOs, wherever we are. We should be central to decision making, not leaving it to bureaucrats and politicians, but actually being decision makers ourselves, right? At least for things that are in and around us, which are affecting us. But as we become those decision makers, which is, let's say, Swaraj, if you look at the original meaning of Swaraj, it is self-rule. So, we as communities are self-rule. It's not about India self-ruling. It's about us as communities, even as individuals. But as we do that, this is crucial second part to it, we are acting responsibly towards the Swaraj of other people. And the reason we have added eco to Swaraj is to say we are also then acting responsibly towards all other species, all other parts of nature. Okay, so it's fairly simple in definition terms. On the ground, obviously, it's much more complex. But can I give you 2 or 3 examples of where this is working?
Yeah, I mean, I was coming to that. Can you give us
Yeah,
a concrete example of a
no, absolutely.
country?
I love telling stories. So you'll have to tell me
Yeah.
when to and shut up, because I can go on for hours with stories. So let me give you 2 or 3, maybe a couple from rural, one from urban. Um, and different cultural contexts. So, one of the ones that I've been recounting and have been part of and have been inspired by for the last more than 3 decades is 5,000, 6,000 Dalit and Adivasi women in Telangana as part of an organization called Deccan Development Society. They've been around for 3+ decades. And they, like Dalit women farmers across India, they are triply disprivileged as Dalits in the caste system, as women in a patriarchal system, and as small scale farmers in a class system where the large farmers are the ones who dominate, right? So, about 30, 35 years back, they gathered themselves into women sanghas with their own elders and some help from a couple of NGO people who had come in from Hyderabad, and said, why should we not struggle for our own dignity using our own knowledge, our own seeds, and our own cooperation with each other? So actually, they brought back about 70, 80 species and varieties of millets, jowar, bajra, ragi, etc., local rice varieties, dal, pulses, and so on. And they said, we are going to share a lot of these seeds with each other, because many of the women had lost those seeds because of the Green Revolution imposition. We'll share the knowledge with regard to how to grow these. We can share our labor, we share water, and we will also fight for land rights for women, which is very unusual in India, right? Which they did. Now, I'm cutting a very long story short, but doing all of that, creating grain banks in every village, so the families had access to seeds to sow. They, in the process of 10, 15 years, they actually created full food security for these 5,000, 4,000, 5,000 households. Remember that when they started, they had malnutrition, hunger, no access to education and health facilities as Dalits and so on. In these 10, 15 years, they transformed that to full food security in these households, significantly better nutritional levels. The studies were done, some scientific studies were done to show that. And very importantly, holding their heads high in the village as Dalits and as women. No longer like having to walk past like this, with so-called upper caste men. Now, that's a radical transformation. But when they did that, they said, why should we stop at food? Our stories are not being told by the mainstream media. Let's create our own media unit. So they have a community media unit. India's first community radio station was started by them, still running. They started making films. They made, I think, about 150 films. I remember the first time I went there in 2000, I think it was. I usually carry my camera around. So I had it, of course, and I was beginning to take pictures. And then I was like taken aback to see this huge, big camera being carried by one of those Dalit women and look facing me. She was photographing, she was videographing me. And I said, whoops, what's happening here, right? And then I realized that they had the agency to make films. Why should I be the photographer? So their own documentation. They started their own alternative school, which didn't run for more than 10 years for various other reasons, and a whole bunch of other things. I don't want to go too long. Now, the uh, basically the sort of short story here is creating lives of dignity with food, housing, education, health, all of them being controlled by these 5,000-6,000 women and their households, transforming their gender relations, etc. And doing all of that without destroying the earth, because they hold soil, earth, and seeds to be sacred. So every festival, they are quote unquote Hindus, but they will celebrate Eid, they will celebrate Christmas, they'll celebrate Jain festivals, and of course Hindu festivals and anything else. In those celebrations, they will do rituals for the earth and for seeds. They will celebrate because for them that's life. For one example. Second, is from, let's say, Central India Adivasi belt, Gadchiroli in Maharashtra. This is Gond and other Adivasis. In the last 3 decades or so, or more, starting with one village called Mendha Lekha, which back in the 1980s, I think, declared, or 70s or 80s declared, that Bombay or Delhi में हमारी सरकार, हमारे गांव में हम ही सरकार. We elect the government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. No decisions will be taken unless they go through the Gram Sabha. No Mukhiya, no Sarpanch, no government officer will take decisions. The entire Gram Sabha, village assembly, with all the adults, but where possible, even children, actually will be part of decision making. That decision was taken, but actually building the capacity to do that takes time. But over 8, 10 years, they did it. I have been to that village many times, and it's remarkable. You can't, as a researcher, I can't go in unless I have sought permission from the Gram Sabha, and the Gram Sabha says, okay, this is fine, but you also need to add this element to your research. You can do a PhD, whatever you want, but this element is important for us, so you have to add it. That empowerment is Swaraj. This is what Gandhiji meant by Swaraj, right? They have taken over full control over their forests. They protect it. They use it for their own sustainable purposes. They've earned something like 4 or 5 crores in the last decade using that sustainably, like bamboo and things like that, but also protecting it and sustaining it. They've taken that control back from the forest department. So that's a second, and that's one village, but then another several hundred villages are actually.
I would just stop you here to ask how much it becomes important for an external actor to be involved in such models.
Yeah, good question. So okay, let me answer that, and then I'll give you one urban example, because people often say that, what about cities? External, what we have found in our work with these communities or in our documentation and studies is that external actors can play a very crucial role, but they're not essential. They're not inevitably essential, right? So there are many situations where, let's say with DDS, these 1 or 2 Hyderabad people actually went there, they started discussing with the women, and then they formed a relationship equality, because they realized that the women also had incredible knowledge. It's just that they didn't feel the confidence to be able to do things on their own. So it became an equal relationship, right? But yeah, there was a both an external and an internal, let's say, catalyst. In the case of Mindaleka, the village I spoke about in Gadchiroli, it started with their own internal rebellion against the imposition of what they felt was unfair rules and laws by the British first. So there was sort of a lot of stuff happening that point in time, and then reviving it now against the imposition of unfair things by the forest department or the imposition of mining uh, contracts from outside. So that's how it started internally. But then a person called Mohan Hirabai Hiralal, the group called uh, Vrikshamitra, he actually went in and he enabled them to learn about national laws and policies, which otherwise is very difficult for local Adivasis to access, so that they could actually, their movement could have become that much more powerful. For instance, taking back control over the forests happened because they learned about the Forest Rights Act. They had already de facto taken some control, but then they used the Forest Rights Act to take legal control back. They were the first village in India, by the way, which got the community forest rights, and then that inspired many others to do it under the law. So yeah, but as I said, there are many where this doesn't happen. I can give you examples from Northeast India, for instance. There's a women's group called Northeast Network, which is all local women. But they realized the gender inequalities they were faced with. They realized that what was coming from outside in the name of agriculture and development was not appropriate. So it was a local movement led by local women who had a certain point of view, and they also had been quote unquote educated, so they could read schemes and what was coming in from outside, critique it, and so on. So you could say a little bit of external influence in the sense that education had come in. But again, there are many examples where maybe people who are not even literate have actually led these movements. Chipko is an example. The Chipko, which I gave you right at the beginning, local women
Right.
completely so-called illiterate. So it depends. It's very varied in terms of what initiates something. But one thing which is common, Ankush, which is very important, even if an external facilitator has catalyzed something, and that could be an NGO, that could be a government officer, it could be a researcher, anyone. At one point or the other, within 5 years, 10 years, if not earlier, the local community needs to be able to take control. It has to develop the capacity to take that process forward. Otherwise, there's this always external dependence, which is a big problem in our development fields.
Right. Right.
Do you want
So
the example? But then I can.
maybe you can quickly touch upon the urban one, and then we can move towards the partnership parts of Vikalp Sangam and Sutra. Yeah.
Okay, so many ones, but let me give you the one again that's been going on for about 10 years. This is in Bhuj, the town of Bhuj in Kutch, where a program called Homes in the City was begun about a decade back by local, some of the slum dwellers and 5 civil society organizations. And basically the attempt was to say, how can slum settlements, which have all the problems that we know of, become places of dignified living? So they started with actually having long discussions about how do you want to rebuild your slum if you had an opportunity to do that, if you had the rights to do it, and if you had the resources, right? Uh, Construction, how should construction be? How would you want to plan the streets? How would you want to plan the sewage and the garbage and the lighting and all of that? And that began an amazing process of actually empowering local communities, settlements and colonies and across Bhuj to do their own thing. And through that, actually say that the constitutional guarantee of self-governance in cities, 74th constitutional amendment. Mendhalekha used the 73rd, by the way, which was rural self-government. So here they use the urban one, which has not been implemented almost anywhere. And they said, let's move towards a situation where planning of Bhuj is not done only by bureaucrats and politicians, but actually by all of us on the ground. Women, girls, empowerment, all of that was part of the process. And then bringing in ecology also into it. So again, a long story, which I'm cutting short. But so you can see that even in urban areas, you can actually make these transformations happen and move towards some kind of eco-swaraj.
Right. So now I come to Vikalp Sangam because Vikalp Sangam brings diverse people, movements, organizations, and community together, and it creates meaning there. So I want to understand like how it all happens, like what it takes to basically bring all of those together, and how to kind of create that platform or an environment where meaning gets created because that's more important.
Yeah, I think you've touched on at least, I mean, at least two or three crucial elements here. Let me just briefly mention where and why networks often fail. And I've been part of many that have also failed. There are many reasons. One is the pace of creating and then, I mean, establishing and then running the network. If it is not slow as in, I don't mean like snail slow, but it has to be sort of some deliberate kind of pace, of a pace in which you can create relationships of trust. This is absolutely crucial. Now, if Kalpavik starts a network, initiates a network, and just says, okay, we will run the network, and the rest of you have to basically, it's just part of it. You don't build those relationships. You don't build a ownership amongst the rest of the members. That dependence remains on Kalpavik. And then at some point or the other, if we withdraw or for some reason, we can't do it anymore, the whole thing collapses. Ego, huge ego hassles in our networks, in our civil society organizations. There's massive thing like, oh, this is my territory, this is your territory kind of thing. How dare you come into this kind of thing? So, who will be the so-called leader? Who will be the face of the movement or the face of the network? So these are some. There are, of course, many other issues there. If you're building something across the country and you haven't built in cultural and language sensitivities into it, you will have English domination or Hindi domination or something like that. And that then, it leaves out, excludes a lot of people or creates resentments and so on. So these are a few things. Now, what we have done with Vikalp Sangam, learning from some of these mistakes that we've made in past networks or networks that we've joined, is we've said right from the beginning that firstly, we will be horizontal. There's no one organization that is going to be taking decisions. So there is a general assembly, which is all the organizations. Right now, there are 95 organizations and movements in it. And all the General Assemblies, the main decisions get taken there. The General Assembly sets up a facilitation team, which has about 8, 9, 10 organizations, which kind of run the day-to-day kind of things. Now, Kalpavik anchors some of these activities. Some other organization might be anchoring some other activities. So the attempt is to try and create horizontality rather than a vertical structure. That's very important. Secondly, we try and be sensitive to as many of the cultural, language, and other sorts of differences, gender differences, issues of disability, issues of pace. Some people like to do seminar kind of pace, others want to do things much more slowly. Issues of not just doing discussion, but also having arts and music and celebration and all of that. So try and create a much more inclusive space for people. Now, what are we doing in Viklab Sangha? Basically, the idea is to say it's a national platform in which all those groups and movements working on alternatives in health, in education, in conservation, in Adivasi rights, in gender, in whatever field you can think of, in media and communication, come together to share their stories, to learn from each other, to create collaborations for more action wherever they are, to learn in a way that if I'm working on gender, I learn from you how conservation takes place and I build that into my work, or together we do it. To do collective dreaming. Now, this is very important, huh? Because Ankush, I think all through, I remember in my school, anytime I was kind of daydreaming, I would be told to get back and do my work or, kind of thing. So we in our very highly productivist kind of economics that we have now, society we have to be productive all the time, which means we can't be daydreaming. So we've set up as a deliberate process by which people envision an India in 2100, which is your ideal vision. Then let's come back to now and say, okay, how do we put this together as a collective? So anyway, that has been happening. We have a vision document called In Search of Radical Alternatives, which keeps evolving. And finally, based on all of this, to do advocacy for the kind of policy shifts and all that we need, but also advocacy in which people get empowered to do their own things, moving towards eco-swaraj and those. So these are 4 or 5 key objectives. And we've done about 35 sangams. These are confluences where we meet for 3, 4, 5 days and do all of these things together in some place. These are thematic sangams, regional sangams, etc. We also do documentation. So I think our website, vikalpsangam.org, has about 2,000 stories of transformation. I just gave you 3, and there are lots more. Anyway, so a whole bunch of other things. And then finally, learning from this, we created a global platform also, which if you want, I can talk about. But this is essentially what it does. Then there are offshoots of this. There's a group called the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group. Basically, here we're trying to do something which can be controversial but essential. That we have political boundaries for whatever historical reasons within India and then between India and the neighboring countries. Many of those are accidents of colonial history, but there could be other reasons also. And we're saying that, of course, boundaries are important, but can they be sensitive to ecological flows and connections and cultural flows and connections? Just to give you one example, the Ganga flows through, I think, 6 or 7 states. Every state decides for its own where to build a dam or a barrage or where to put a factory and throw pollution into the Ganga, negatively impacting everything downstream, people and wildlife downstream, right? Without asking them. So
Right.
can the Ganga as a whole be seen as one political unit or one unit for political and economic planning? Very difficult, of course, but you can take much smaller ones also.
Right.
So that's what we call biocultural regional planning or biocultural regional living, looking at much larger landscapes where nature and culture has flowed in the past and to some extent still flows. How can we recreate those flows?
Right.
It's all part of the Vikalp Sangam process.
So I think confluences are great, but I think equally important is to keep the community alive between the two confluences. So what is the process that keeps this community alive and uh, going together, helping each other, collaborating?
So between the confluences, and the confluences are not necessarily the same people. I mean, they're in different parts of India, different thematic areas. So we have maybe in these 35 confluences, we must have had, I don't know, 5,000-10,000 people or something like that. So they're from diverse backgrounds. And they're not necessarily the same in every confluence. But what happens is that some of these confluences lead to longer term relationships. So the Western Himalaya, all the 4 states, union territories of the Western Himalaya have what's called the Western Himalaya Vikalp Sangam process, which kind of became kind of independent. Still reports back to the National Vikalp Sangam, but it's also running its own independently with its own funding and so on. Now they have confluences, but they have exchange programs in between the confluences. They have online sessions. Just 3 days back, there was an online session from a Ladakhi friend on how to live with snow leopards. So experiences from the villages there. They have training sessions on community-led ecotourism, on nature guiding. They have documentation of stories. So all of this is happening as part of the Western Himalaya Vikalp Sangam process. It's not only those physical confluences. It's really many different moving parts which kind of get built in together. So for us, that's very, very important. And then, of course, the General Assembly, the National General Assembly meets once a year or once a year physically, once a year online. So that's where we review things, we reconnect, we build new relationships, we build new plans. Yeah.
So I have some probing questions here, basically. I would say you framework places community in the center, right, of what we do. But community is not harmonious. There is gender, there is caste, religious, uh, also local power hierarchy, not necessarily related to feudal or patriarchal. Uh, so how does the Eco Swaraj model prevents from making another power centers or local elites?
Yeah. Very important. And actually, this is why the first example I gave you was of those Dalit women farmers. But because you can see there that they while working on food and media and all of that, they also had to deal with these internal local power dynamics. But let me go back to something I mentioned earlier, the flower of transformation. So as part of the Vikalp Sangam framework, we have this 5 petal kind of intersecting petals flower and with a core. The 5 petals are political, social, cultural, ecological, and economic. And as I said, they're intersecting. So what our approach, and at the core of that flower is ethics and values. Things like solidarity, diversity, generosity, interdependence, peace, nonviolence, etc. So what we're saying is that whatever approach we take, let's say we go in with an ecological perspective and say we want to protect forests and wildlife and ecosystem, right? Unless we are also looking at the other 4 petals, we could make horrible mistakes. For instance, we could get into a situation, and there are many places like that, where the community is protecting the forest very well, but it's the upper caste men who are taking the decision, or the landed families who are taking a decision. They have land, they don't have dependence on the forest, so they say, oh, we're going to protect the forest and we look good to the outside world. But those who are landless, who were dependent on the forest for their livelihood, actually get excluded, right? So the petal of social justice has to come in here. Is the conservation of forests happening along with social justice objectives also being met, or is it actually making injustice worse? Yeah. Or men taking the decisions? Is that making gender injustice worse, or actually are women being empowered, self-empowered to actually be part of decision making on what happens to the ecosystem in the forest? That's one example, but you can take anything else. You can go in with
Right.
gender as an objective, and then ask this question. Okay, that's fine, but is gender empowerment happening in such a way that actually the forest is being cut down to get the money for women to be trained into something else? So conservation is anyway. So basically, using this, we would say that all five are equally important, and certainly in a country like India or anywhere else for the matter, traditional and new inequalities and discriminations have to be equally a part of the struggle as anything else.
Right. I have few more, but I would ask just one last question and probably let others, anybody else has any questions or any thoughts to share here. For people who are already working inside existing institution, can be government, CSR, philanthropy, NGOs, right? Uh, or even social enterprises, what they can realistically adopt from your framework or from your work for tomorrow? How can they enable an ecosystem inspired by these principles? And I would say, like, can you name few things which they should be like completely focused? I mean, they should ensure that they are not getting diluted in this whole process.
So one thing, okay, there are many things. One of the things which we've been trying to tell both donors and philanthropic organizations and government institutions, and sometimes even our own NGO colleagues, is that process is more important than project. So again, the examples I gave you, where processes took 5, 10 years, sometimes even longer, before they were set into place where the communities could themselves carry that on further. Now, if you go in with a project mindset, 3 years, I have to make all this thing happen in 3 years, and then after that, I withdraw, or I don't know whether there'll be any further funding for that or not, or support for that. It's not going to work. You'll set up the infrastructure, you might create a couple of local leaders, etc. But mostly it actually will collapse after that, or it'll go in a very different direction than what you might have intended. So process over project, or process over a very sort of productivist output oriented kind of approach. Second, first understand what are the local capacities, skills, knowledge, expertise already available, and build on that. Don't assume that local people don't have these things and you're only coming with your own external knowledge, right? Now, again, a lot of external institutions find that very difficult to swallow, to say that, oh, local people actually might know more than I do about it. But it follows. No, if local people have been living in an area for hundreds of years, they would know about that area better than any external person. But you might, as an external person, also know some things they don't know. So you build an equal relationship of knowledge sharing, of respectful knowledge sharing, which can actually then produce kind of information and knowledge and analysis that you need for a successful process and outcome. That's the second very important thing. Third, be aware of local inequalities. Exactly the point that you just raised a few minutes back, that you go in and you say, okay, I'll speak to the sarpanch, and if he, mostly it's a he, if he's okay with it, then I'll go in for this particular project or this investment. But no, have you spoken to local women? Have you spoken to local landless people? Have you spoken to local Dalits or Adivasis or whoever? People who have actually been most marginalized in that society are the ones that need to be. Now, this is difficult because you go in, you might actually get thrown out of the village by the sarpanch or the dominant society. So you have to go in with that mindset saying, look, I'm here for a long time and I will continue being here despite this, because I want to work with the most marginalized sections, right? And I know that this could be risky or it's much more difficult. Um, I mean, I can go on more and more, but I mean, these are some of the things. Now, time and again, what we see is that government, somebody is well-meaning, picks up on a particular kind of an approach, puts it into a scheme, and then says, let it happen in 1,000 villages. Doesn't work like that. Just doesn't work like that. So, how do we get these mindsets to change is something that I don't know. I mean, you people might be better at figuring that out than I have. I have been working with government agencies for decades. I stopped working 15 years back. I didn't think there was much point. I was wasting my time.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen it very closely.
Yeah.
Sometimes some of these policies come out very nicely when you are attending those conferences and when they're being shaped. And but when they come on ground, it's completely different. Like intensive participatory planning exercises around NREGS was one such thing which I felt would be game changer, but I think the way it gets practiced on ground is completely different from the spirit in which it actually comes up with.
But there are exceptions, Ankush, and I think it's important to point them out. So I think for a certain period of time, for instance, the Kerala local village planning process 10 years back or whenever, because the people who were in charge of that actually wanted it to be a process and not just a output kind of thing, it ran well for a while, and it produced some very good stuff. I have been to another one in Jharkhand, a state government corporation called Jharcraft, which was oriented to building or rebuilding the craft skills of 18 different kinds of crafts across Jharkhand. And for a decade, it went actually very well. Some 300,000 families benefited from it. I don't know what it is right now. But so you can actually create a different thing if if the government allows the particular team of people that freedom and that time and space to create the process and set it in motion rather than just, okay, in 3 years, this is what you have to do. Well, it's possible, but
Yeah.
very few examples.
Yeah. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you, and I'm sure like the others as well. I hope you won't mind staying back here for a few more minutes for others also to probably ask few questions or share their thoughts around it. Uh, Shilpa, Hema, Delnaz, Rajesh, anybody has they want to interact here? Feel
Yes,
free.
I would like to.
Yeah,
Can
please
you
go ahead.
hear me? Um, so, Mr. Kothari, wonderful listening to you. What my question is, do you see a change in the attitude nowadays of the youngsters? I mean, do you think that they are more receptive to, the kind of programs you are doing?
Sorry, change in attitude amongst whom?
Youngsters.
Youngsters.
Youngsters, youth. Yes and no. I have, yeah, maybe I think in the last 10, 15 years, I've spoken to several thousand young people across India and the rest of the world on alternatives. And one thing that I've found almost universally is that there is a lot of interest because for once they're actually listening to stories of hope and inspiration. It's not just doomsday, 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 which is what they get in the media all the time, even in their studies. No? And almost every time they say, how come we don't actually have this in our studies? Or why do we not read this in the mainstream or see this in the mainstream media, right? So people sit up and they say, oh, really, this is happening. We had no idea. Maybe about 10%, 5 to 10% of them might say, okay, how can we help? How can we get involved? And so this is a very interesting conversation that we have the Gen Z, but also the previous generations. There is that level of interest, and we of course also know that the level of information about ecological and social issues today is much greater than, for instance, when I was in my school and college. There's just so much more information available, social media, blah blah blah. But this is very important. The level of patience that you need to then actually start working on something like this is sorely lacking. It's not their fault. It is a system, including social media, which has created so much distraction, so much of rapid eye movement that unless I have seen something in 30 seconds, I lose interest and move to some other reel or some other whatever it is they call it, right? So I don't know how many young people still see 50-minute films or read a 300-page book. Everything has to be capsuled in. Now, when you capsule it, you might do it creatively, but you necessarily lose nuance, you lose sophistication, you lose depth, right? So we should have all these short things, but there needs to be the space and the time for people to absorb things in a more nuanced and deeper way. So that is a bit, bit of a problem. And the maybe one last thing I'll say here is that we've seen some of the most incredible revolutions by youth across the world. You see what happened in Nepal, before that in Bangladesh, it happened in Madagascar, or right now this cockroach Janata Party, right? So there is that enthusiasm, there's a frustration, there's a desire to do something. And that includes bringing down regimes which are felt to be very corrupt and domineering, right? Like in Nepal. But, and this is great, it's fantastic, it's amazing energy, all hats off to them. But do they then have, or while they're doing this, do they have what one calls a prefigurative sense, which is to say a sense of where do we want society to go to if we have brought this regime down? We don't want corruption. That's okay. This is what the Cockroach Janata Party is saying, no corruption. Okay, that's fine and important. But what kind of economy do we want? What kind of politics do we want? What kind of society do we want? Is there some thinking along those lines? And I find that generally either there isn't, or it's somewhere suppressed within the overall this thing of resistance and protest and bringing somebody down. So this is why I think very important for us to have intergenerational dialogues between those of us who, for whatever reasons, not for us to impose our things. I think that would be wrong, but to say this is what we have learned. You take it or leave it. You may learn from it, may not. But here are 50 examples of alternatives. So if you are saying we're going to bring this particular government down, you could come up based on those 50 alternatives. You could come up with your own vision of where we want the next government to go, or we want our own societies, our own communities. As young people go back to our own communities and say, we want to help transform it in this direction. This is really crucial, and I think it's weak at the moment.
So you mentioned future year 2070, I think you mentioned, a vision that you all have. So how do you see it? I mean, are you hopeful, or I don't know, are we going to be in the same situation? Or
Well, I mean, our vision is actually 2100. We have a book called Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. You'll find it online. You can download it free for PDF version. That has 35 essays on India in 2100. What kind of education, what kind of gender, what kind of conservation, etc. And then bring it back to saying, now this is the current situation. How do we get there? What are the hurdles? What are the opportunities? Who will do it, etc. Right? So those are all available. And we also have a vision of South Asia in 2100, where rivers are again running free, where nature is connecting with each other. People are able to go back and forth across boundaries without visas, all that. Right? Now, these are visions. Will we get to that? I really don't know. But the only reason I'm hopeful, despite the fact that we are today in a much worse situation than we were 47 years back when I started doing this kind of work. Unfortunately, we are in a much worse situation. We're collapsing in many different ways. The reason I'm hopeful is learning from history. Two things. One, our consciousness about these things is much higher, as I said, than before. And we can use that consciousness to good effect. But secondly, learning from history. Two movements in history which have, I think, which we can learn from. One is the anti-colonial movement. So we know that Europe colonized the world for 500 years, about. And there was a time when it was said that the sun will never set on the British Empire. The sun did set on the British Empire, and then right now, actually, the sun is not even rising on the British Empire, if there is any such thing left. But that period of countries becoming free of their colonial masters was a very short period, 40, 50 years, actually, after 500 years of colonialism. And at that point in time, if you had asked me this question, and if I'd said we have hope of breaking free of colonial shackles, people would have said, come on, you're just a hopeless optimistic. But so that's one very important one. Second, the feminist movement. Now, I don't fully understand it because, but from if you look at the 100 years, 150 years of the feminist movement, it started off as individual women asking for equal rights, fighting against discrimination, standing up and saying we have the same right to education as men do, etc. Right? At which point in time people would have said, "Come on, it's hopeless. There's no way you can actually beat male domination. It's been around for thousands of years." But today, the situation, the fact, Hema, that you can actually ask me this question online and not be sitting at home and cooking for your husband or brother or father or whatever it is because of this movement, right? Which started off sporadic, a few individual women in an era where there was no social media, they couldn't even communicate with each other in that way, became a global narrative and created massive changes. Not that patriarchy is gone. In many ways, it's still there. But some of its worst forms are gone, and women have made huge straight. Not just women, but multiple genders, LGBTQ plus. Now, imagine LGBTQ plus being able to be out on the streets and declaring themselves as LGBTQ. Even 20 years back, this would have been very difficult in India. They would have been beaten to death or whatever, right? So things can change. It takes time. It starts small, scattered, builds momentum, becomes a global narrative. And I think the third such global narrative now is the ecological one. So that's what I'm hopeful for, that in the next couple of generations, we will see these bigger, much bigger shifts beginning to take place.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Hema. Shilpa, do you want to come in or Delnas? Otherwise, we would wrap because we have already gone past the session time.
Yeah, any of the other member, if outside of the organization wants to speak first, I just want to I will thanks to Kothari sir, because he himself is a whole book. While listening to him, I was recalling my fellowship days, and I can relate to it how government works, and is the any process or scheme, how the percolation goes to the ground, the implementation of the scheme, what the marginalized people get out of it, and how it forms in the particular department. Yeah, so that gap I have seen clearly while working in rural areas of Raigad and some of the part of Maharashtra. So thank you so much, sir. We have shared some websites and resources where sir is working, so people can visit the sites to get the information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thanks a lot.
So with this, we'll try to wrap this session. And I'm sure like Ashish is in Pune and I'm here, so I would try to probably, buzz him more and trouble him more by visiting his place. But
Most welcome.
yeah, for this conversation, I'll say it's not about rejecting all existing institution, or rather, I would also say romanticizing alternatives. I guess it's more about we must learn from community-led, ecology-centered, and justice-oriented models if we want partnerships to become truly equal and transformative. So, any last thoughts, Ashish? And then we can wrap it up.
No, you're absolutely right. One thing that we talk about is transitions to transformation. The kind of transformations I'm talking about, a world which, where there isn't centralized power and where capitalist corporations are not dominating us, etc., is a world that's still distant away. It's already happening in some places, but for the globe as a whole, it's distant away. So we need to look at transitions, and those transitions work through what you're saying. You work with some existing institutions, try and make those policy shifts, etc. But always, that needs to be in the direction of these fundamental transformations, not in the direction of the same institutions becoming that much more powerful, which is unfortunately what happens with a lot of development sector inputs. So this is crucial. Where is power going to? How much is it being distributed? Is environment being protected? Is nature being respected? Those fundamental questions, are gender relations becoming more equal? Those are fundamental questions we need to ask in whatever we do.
Perfect. Thank you, Ashish, for your time, and hope to have another conversation very soon.
Thank you, Ankush. Thank you to the whole team.
Bye, everyone.
Great session.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.